Hi. Okay, this is just a mini lecture doing an overview from chapter 22, sections 1 through 3 that we're not covering in lecture. And let's just start of the pathway of air through our respiratory system, beginning with our nose. Then it's going to enter our paranasal sinuses, eventually hit our pharynx, which is further divided into three subdivisions, beginning with our nasopharynx. Then we have our oropharynx and laryngopharynx. After our pharynx, we're going to enter the larynx, then our trachea. Our trachea is then going to divide into right and left bronchi, and the bronchi are going to further branch into main or primary bronchi, and then these are going to further branch into what we call lobar or secondary bronchi, and those are going to further branch into segmental or tertiary bronchi. At the end of the segmental bronchi, we're going to have the terminal bronchi. And at the very end of our terminal bronchi, we have the smallest bronchi, which are our respiratory bronchioles. These respiratory bronchioles are going to connect with alveolar ducts, and these alveolar ducts are going to further connect with alveolar sacs. And alveolar sacs are just clusters of alveoli. Going back up here, just as a reminder, our larynx is also considered our voice box because it houses our vocal cords, and our trachea can also be called our windpipe here. We also have two different parts of our respiratory system, one that we consider our upper respiratory system and one our lower respiratory system. So beginning with our nose all the way down to the last subdivision of our pharynx, this is considered your upper respiratory system. And then everything from our larynx all the way down to our alveolar sacs. Let's see if I can draw this. This is your lower respiratory system. So the main function of our upper respiratory system is really just to warm and humidify and filter incoming air. When we get to our lower respiratory system, this could be further divided into two different zones. One that we call the conducting zone, where we're just having passage of air through these tubules, and the other one's the respiratory zone, where we have actual gas exchange. So our conducting zone is typically considered all the way from our larynx all the way down to our terminal bronchioles. This would be our conducting zone. And then once we hit our respiratory bronchioles and including our alveolar sacs, this is considered our respiratory zone. So this is where actual gas exchange is going to occur. Respiratory. So that's pretty much it when we talk about pathway of airflow. A couple other things I wanted to point out is that we actually have four different processes that can be considered when we're talking about respiration. And when we're talking about pulmonary ventilation, that's our actual breathing. So this is our inspiration and our expiration. So inhaling and exhaling. So this is basically the gas exchange between our lungs and the atmosphere. So inspiration, you probably remember, that's going to move air into our lungs from the atmosphere, and expiration is going to move the air that's in our lungs back out into the atmosphere. We also have external respiration, and this is going to be the gas exchange between the blood and the lungs, or the lungs and the blood. So, lungs and blood. And during external respiration, we have oxygen that's going to diffuse out from our lungs into our blood. And we're also going to have CO2 that's in our blood diffuse out into the lungs. The third type of, or third process of respiration is the transport of respiratory gases. But this is the primary focus of the cardiovascular system, which we already covered in chapter, I think it was 17 and 18, no, 18 and 19. And so we use the blood as a transporting system to transport all the respiratory gases that we need. So our oxygen is going to be transported from our lungs to the tissues, from lungs to tissues. And then, of course, we're going to want to pick up the carbon dioxide from our tissues and send it back to the lungs so we can exhale it from from tissues back out to our lungs. And the fourth process of respiration is internal respiration, and we're talking about gas exchange between our blood and our tissues. So blood and tissue. So we're going to have oxygen leave our blood, from our blood, go into our tissues so we can use it for cellular respiration. And then we're going to have carbon dioxide that's built up, in our tissues from as a waste product of cellular respiration that's going to enter our blood. So the process here and here is reversed as far as when we're talking about the direction of movement of oxygen between external and internal respiration. So there is a difference. So make sure you're aware of what they're talking about as far as gas exchange and the difference between external and internal respiration. The other thing I wanted to talk about was the respiratory membrane. The respiratory membrane is pretty much where our alveoli membrane meets our capillary membrane. And if you remember looking at the lung in the histology section of ANP1, you know that's like some simple squamous tissue that make up the alveolar sacs. So between the alveoli and the capillary membrane, we also have between those two what's called a basement membrane that's just made up of a thin layer of connective tissue between the alveoli and the capillary. So all three of these are considered the respiratory membrane. And again, this is going to be where gas exchange occurs. We have a couple different types of cells that we can find in the alveoli. So the most common type, so about 97% of the cells in your alveoli are type 1 alveoli cells. And again, these are going to make up the bulk of the walls of the alveoli. So they're made up of simple squamous tissue, and they're going to allow for gas exchange. The second type of cell that you can find in the alveoli are type 2 alveoli cells. And their whole purpose is to produce surfactant. And surfactant is basically a lipid-like substance, and I think there's some proteins in there too. And they help reduce the surface tension created between hydrogen bonds and water, and they help prevent the alveolar sacs from collapsing. And the third type of cell that we have there are alveolar macrophages, and their whole function is really just to engulf bacteria and any foreign debris if it's actually able to reach the alveolar sacs. For the most part, your alveoli are pretty sterile environments, and bacteria if they reach it. Okay, the other thing I wanted to talk about is bronchial circulation. So just like when we talked about the heart and how the coronary arteries actually supplied the heart or the cardiac muscle tissue itself, it wasn't able to actually use the blood that was in its four different chambers. The same thing happens with our lungs. So our lungs cannot actually use the blood that's flowing through them. Instead, they have to have their own circulation to receive heavily oxygenated blood. And this is supplied via the bronchial arteries. So instead of the coronary arteries, we have the bronchial arteries. They're going to come in and supply the oxygenated blood to the lung tissue. And where do they come from? They come from the aorta. Another thing I wanted to talk about was innervation. So the lung, just like the heart, is innervated by both your parasympathetic nervous system and your sympathetic nervous system. If we have parasympathetic nervous system stimulation, this is going to cause constriction. And if we have sympathetic nervous system stimulation, this is going to cause dilation. Dilation. Another thing when we talk about innervation is we also have visceral sensory fibers that are present in our lung tissue. And these all enter through the pulmonary plexus. Okay, the final thing, I think, yes, okay, is the serous membranes, which you should know pretty well from A&P1. So we have the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. The parietal pleura is going to be the one that's covering the thoracic wall. And part of your diaphragm. And I think it's the superior part. And part of your diaphragm. And then the visceral pleura is going to cover the individual lungs. In between these two spaces, we have pleural fluid or the pleural cavity. So between these, we have the pleural cavity, which houses pleural fluid, pleural fluid. And these will play a role when we talk about the different pressures within our lungs that allow for gas exchange. Okay, so this is basically it for the overview. Things that you should definitely know for the upcoming exam, and go in and read your slides about it as well.